Hello, and welcome everyone to the Blockchain for Enterprise Applications webinar. I am Austin Fassman, and I will be your host for today. I am Appian's product strategy developer, and my role is basically to investigate and prototype disruptive technologies and to help align Appian's strategy to be poised to adopt and take advantage of these technologies as they emerge. Today, we have a great presentation in store on how blockchain is more than just Bitcoin and financials, and really how it applies to enterprises, business networks, and supply chains. We'll kick things off with a presentation from Principal Analyst Craig Wentworth from MWD Advisors. Craig focuses and has experience on blockchain technologies, cloud platforms, IoT, and AI. Before MWD, he was the Director of Organization and User Innovation at JISC, where he spent 8 years advising higher education establishments on the cultural adoption of technology services and the effects of disruptive technologies. After Craig's presentation, I'll be giving a live demo of an application built within Appian using Appian's Ethereum plugin. Craig, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much. Today I'm going to be talking about what the key characteristics of blockchain technologies are, what it is and what it isn't good for, and also how to test a potential application for blockchain affinity, shall we say, and how blockchain can be applied, of course, in a variety of use cases right across different industries, and what we can learn from the experience of early adopters. So, to begin properly, what is this blockchain thing anyway, beyond cryptocurrencies and so on? How and why is it becoming such big news across a breadth of industries, and not just finance either? But before I start to talk about blockchain in the enterprise properly, I will just say that there are, of course, many places you can get a blockchain technology primer on the web that will explain the technology from first principles, and I'm not going to repeat all that here. But I will spend a little time talking about what blockchain is and where it came from, because I think it's important to get across some of the key characteristics of the technology so we can focus on how it and the new approaches and the new business models that come with it, how it can be applied to your particular setting. So, in order to show how blockchain technologies might affect business systems, I think we first need to look at some of the challenges that organizations face when transacting business with each other. These transactions might relate to tangible assets like land or cars or food or components in a supply chain, or intangible assets such as intellectual property, designs, patents, rights controlling access and use of data, or indeed the exchange of data itself. And I think it's useful to think of all the parties involved as being part of a business system whose component parts all communicate and exchange assets and value with each other as part of a business network. In pre-digital times, if you like, business systems were complicated, they were expensive and time-consuming to set up and configure and reconfigure, so they tended to be relatively static. However, the modern phenomenon of global mass interconnectivity has brought in more and more flexibility and much greater scales of operations, and that's given rise to increasingly diverse and complex ecosystems. And nowadays, business transactions might be coordinated across multiple parties and spread across multiple geographies and legal jurisdictions. And each participant will know some of these parties and might well trust a subset of them to a certain extent. However, in many cases, there will be parties that just don't know or trust each other directly at all. And some of these parties will be organizations, some will be individuals, some may be automated network-connected devices and business infrastructure components. And collectively, they all represent customers, suppliers, partners, regulators, government institutions, and so on, each with a stake in the system or the market that they're operating in. And in many cases, one party in particular will act as an intermediary or a central controlling authority to ensure that everyone follows the rules, a bit like the network shown on this slide. But all this oversight and orchestration comes at a cost in time and money, and the need to develop a trust relationship so everyone's happy with the arrangement. And these systems rarely operate in isolation too. Where processes and transactions cross boundaries, there's inevitably friction. And friction causes headaches, and those headaches cost time and money to fix. So what changes here in a blockchain world? Well, If that business network were on a blockchain, it would look a bit like this, really. It works on a peer-to-peer basis, where transactions take place between network users directly without recourse to a central trusted intermediary. And instead, these transactions are verified by peer users themselves and indelibly recorded in a shared public ledger that becomes distributed around the user network. Distributed ledgers, like the Bitcoin blockchain, for example, are replicated, shared, synchronized digital data stores that are spread across multiple locations and potentially across multiple organizations, multiple geographies, and so on. And unlike traditional databases, there's no centralized store, nor indeed a central administrator or authority overseeing such a store. It's designed to enable parties in the business network who don't necessarily fully trust each other to form and maintain the consensus about the state of the data stored on it. For it to work, the parties involved need to be connected on a peer-to-peer network, and they need to abide by the decision algorithms deployed to ensure consensus. And this way, the version of the ledger synchronized across the network is taken as being the mutually agreed system of record and the de facto source of truth as far as those network members are concerned. So what makes blockchains valuable? Well, it's important to remember that just like a historical paper ledger, a blockchain ledger is an append-only storage system. So none of the network members can undo a transaction. If there's found to be an error, then a new transaction will need to be committed to the chain to effectively reverse the earlier one. And this gives the ledger its immutability, which is a key characteristic when you need an indelible record that can't be altered. And because in a blockchain network there's no central single source of truth that everyone has to rely on, it's imperative that the parties in a network have a commonly agreed way to settle on the correctness of a transaction. And that's referred to as a consensus mechanism. And there are various mechanisms available that help a blockchain network arrive at consensus. Some, like proof of work that Bitcoin uses, are optimal in an environment in which none of the parties have existing trust relationships, but they're expensive in case of time and money to operate. And there are others that incur far less cost, but they rely on there being certain amounts of trust and identity assurance in blockchain relationships based on existing real-world business relationships and contractual agreements and so on. So your choice of consensus mechanism, if you have a choice, is therefore very important. Now, blockchain technology is evolving and its applicability is changing as a result. And there are private permissioned blockchains that have grown up alongside their older public cousins now, and their attributes are tuned to particular enterprise business use cases. But it's not as simple as public bad, private good when it comes to business blockchains. For a start, there's a next generation of public blockchains now making a play for enterprise use cases too, so the picture is far more nuanced. In a public blockchain, trust between parties is not assumed or indeed possible. It's an open community, so anyone can join. But without further access and identity controls, you can't guarantee that any party is who they say they are in the real world. And that counts for things and devices as well as people. Consensus options are limited and potentially expensive. However, if you're truly operating in a no-trust environment, the ability to transact any business at all might well be worth the cost. And transaction speeds are also limited because you can't tune the network as you would if it were operating as your own private network. Bitcoin's blockchain, for instance, has a theoretical maximum throughput of only around 7 transactions per second. And if you compare this to the Visa network's average of closer to 2,000, and of course it's got a peak load much, much higher than that, it's obviously lacking for any serious B2B payment platform scenario. However, it's not all bad. I mean, some B2C relationships map on quite well to public blockchain because of the nature of the trust environment, i.e. where there isn't a pre-existing, strong, known identity relationship amongst peers. And also, public blockchains can be used for anchoring, whereby data, say the output of a business process, a document, a database, or even the state of a private blockchain running alongside, is cryptographically hashed, and this value is used as a digital fingerprint that's written to the chain as proof of existence. And that's something that can be referred to later to prove authenticity of the item. So public blockchains are popular for this because with a much larger pool of consenting committers to the chain, they're generally less likely to be compromised in a no-trust environment. And if you compare this with private blockchains, well, they're hosted within secure and permissioned networks, so you can attest to the validity of users' identities. Membership is defined within the context of and can leverage the roles conveyed by business relationships that exist outside of the blockchain in the real world. You don't need to incentivize so-called miners with cryptocurrency to operate the consensus mechanism because it can rely on much more real-world relationships, and that's a very important distinction. If your B2B network is private and you can fall back on other methods that leverage known identities and business relationships, then a proof-of-work consensus mechanism, for example, would represent with an unnecessary cost. Transactions potentially benefit from enhanced privacy because network controls can specify which parties have visibility of which activity and what data. And not every party, of course, needs necessarily to see every transaction or indeed even be aware that it's taken place. And a private blockchain can also grant enhanced permissions to system-wide auditors for transparent and real-time inspection of compliance with regulations. So let's take a look at some of these by way of example. First up here is Ethereum, and whilst it's sometimes mentioned in the same breath as Bitcoin because it also supports a digital token system, and it currently relies on proof-of-work consensus, Ethereum was conceived for quite another purpose. Its Ether coins are mined to pay for the computational resources that run distributed applications on its platform without human intervention through something called smart contract code. And in addition to people deploying the open source Ethereum itself, JP Morgan has developed what it refers to as an enterprise-focused version of Ethereum in the form of Quorum. And Consensus recently announced availability of its Kaleido platform Ethereum-based blockchain as a service offering on AWS. And the Ethereum Foundation itself has begun to address some enterprise concerns too around privacy and scalability through the work of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. And that's with its member companies drawn from enterprises and startups and academics and tech vendors who all have an interest in how Ethereum develops for the enterprise. And most recently, the Alliance has announced the Enterprise Ethereum Architecture Stack and a client specification. This is a conceptual framework and a standards-based specification for its definition of Enterprise Ethereum. It's hoped that this will allow vendors to construct standards-based solutions on Ethereum that satisfy enterprise requirements like privacy and scaling and tooling and application development without having to build it all from scratch. Also looking to address some of these next generation concerns is Hyperledger, and that's the Linux Foundation's open source initiative. It was launched in 2016, initially with 30 founding corporate members, but it's now got over 200 organizations under the umbrella. And it acts as a place for a number of individual interoperable open-sourced projects on permissioned blockchain tools and blockchain frameworks. And some of its live or incubating projects at the moment include things like Hyperledger Fabric, which is probably the most famous one. That's permissioned blockchain framework that underpins a number of commercial blockchain as a service offerings. It supports separately permissioned channels that can isolate transactions in different ledgers, which provides parallelism and privacy. It's got a variety of pluggable consensus algorithms. You can map different network node types onto different user role types from the business relationships that the blockchain supports. And then there's Hyperledger Sawtooth, which is designed with built-in parallelism for large-scale networks, Aroha for infrastructure projects, Indy for decentralized identities, Burrow, that's an interesting one. It's a blockchain client that can execute Ethereum smart contract code. Hyperledger Quilt is a tool for interoperation between different types of ledgers. It's becoming increasingly useful for that. And Composer, which is designed to make it much easier to develop blockchain applications on its smart contracts or chain code, as it's known in Hyperledger. And the last one I'm calling out specifically is R3, which describes itself as a fintech software company working with a network of over 200 banks, regulators, trade associations, professional service firms, tech vendors, and so on, all collaborating to develop its Corda blockchain platform. And originally R3 restricted its activities to blockchain-related projects in the financial services sector, but since many of those financial use cases actually have applicability in other sectors around trade and financing of goods and services and so on, Unsurprisingly, we're seeing exploration of R3 Corda creep into many other areas. And Corda can run anywhere that a Java virtual machine can go, so on-premise or in the cloud. There's an open source distribution, an enterprise version that includes some commercial extensions. Organizations can run Corda for their own permissioned blockchain network, or R3 has recently announced plans to launch what it calls the Corda network, and that's designed to enable all permissioned Corda blockchains and their applications to interoperate on the same business network if they need to, a bit like the Ethereum mainnet. And whilst that's not a production-ready environment just yet, if it becomes widely adopted, I think it promises scope for much easier integration between different Corda applications. So all that's well and good. We know what blockchains are, how they work, what makes them different, but assuming you're not simply planning a token sale or developing a crypto-compatible retail site, what use are they in enterprise applications and how can they add value? Well, let's start with looking at what you can actually store on the blockchain, regardless of whether it's public or private. Well, most first-generation blockchains don't store real non-cryptocurrency data in the blockchain itself because too much of that can lead to something called chain bloat, where there's so much data being committed that it becomes far too slow and costly to really do anything useful. And instead, they store digital fingerprints or hash values that link to digital assets that have to be held elsewhere. I mean, they're off-chain, but they're somewhere accessible by bona fide interested parties. And in these cases, the blockchain then is used to track ownership of these assets and act as an immutable log of activity. And this means that although these blockchains can enable trivial tasks, and they can make cryptocurrency payments, and they can provide this proof of existence for an item of hashed content, such as a document or a sidechain in a process known as anchoring, they can't really be used to run any more complex processes. And actually, this limits their practical use in business. However, developments in blockchain technology post-Bitcoin, blockchain's second generation onwards, if you like, have enabled complex business logic in the form of smart contracts to be encoded into blockchains themselves. And this code can run against data that's held on-chain or make reference to data held elsewhere. And these smart contracts, which I said called chain code in Hyperledger, so you may have heard that term, can be used as part of a workflow that's facilitating machine-to-machine or machine-to-person and machine-to-business interactions. And it's arguably this advance that's paved the way for an explosion of non-cryptocurrency interest in blockchain technology, enabling people to effectively develop distributed applications that reside and run on a blockchain, triggered by external events and pulling in data from the internet or from IoT. Having laid all this out then, where do blockchains fit in today and what are they particularly good for? Well, essentially blockchain technology has the potential to help organizations most in situations where B2B business processes extend beyond the oversight and management provided by any single organization, and where there's a desire to remove costly and complex intermediaries, or where there's no obvious suitable candidate for the role. And related to this, where there's a drive to make the process of compliance auditing more efficient, moving from retrospective periodic reporting to real-time inspection of a transparent ledger. And it's ideal where multiple parties share control over data, i.e. they're not simply sharing access to it, because there's lots of other things that can help you out there, really. And also where there's a need to track assets across multi-party, multi-jurisdiction, end-to-end supply chains, and to be able to provide authoritative sources of provenance information. And particularly in the case of public blockchains, where there's a need to execute transactions securely or establish proof of existence transaction outputs in a no-trust environment. However, as with anything that has the potential to impact organizations' processes and behaviors, implementing a blockchain within a business network will involve significant effort and cost. And what this means is that unless there's a dominant partner in a consortium driving the change forwards, maybe a government department or the manufacturer at the head of a supply chain, if you want to pursue blockchain technology, you'll need to not only create a shared business case for implementing the change overall, each individual organization taking part also needs to be assured that its own interests are best served by the change. And correspondingly, what's it not good for? Well, whilst a blockchain can serve as a database for recording transactions and a platform for executing applications, it's not a replacement for every type of database or application platform. It's not without its pain to set up and run, as we've covered earlier. Plus, its distributed nature also incurs a speed penalty. So, if a requirement is well enough addressed within traditional centralized database or platform controlled by a single authority in the traditional manner, or it can be addressed perfectly well using replication or multiple databases, or if all the data access control and processing required to coordinate the business system is taking place under the authority of a single organization with no cross-boundary or trust concerns, then your business case for employing blockchain technology is going to be weak. So, to summarize this section then, how do you determine if your specific business problem is one which lends itself well to blockchain cloud solutions, at least in part? Well, you can start by asking yourself these sorts of questions. Is your current system overly complex or costly due to intermediaries exercising a function of oversight or centralized control? Does your business respect the notion of data self-sovereignty, where individuals are able to exert much more control over how their data is used? Is there a lack of trust causing friction between your partners? Do you need to determine the provenance of physical assets? Do you have business processes which cross organizational boundaries outside the realms of your BPM system and beyond simple content collaboration workflows? And or do you have processes that ought to happen remotely and autonomously? And if you're nodding, and I can see you, then blockchain could well be for you. So whilst there's very little out there in terms of large-scale deployments of blockchain technologies in the wild, that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't lots of inspiring, innovative proofs of concept running across a range of industries, and some even mature enough to already have gone into at least limited production. Here's some examples from the financial sector. In cross-border payments and trade finance and securities, blockchains remove the need for a trusted counterparty as the intermediary, and that can eliminate the risk of a single point of failure and also provide transparency across the payment platform. Blockchains can also help a supply chain ecosystem establish an agile, fluid pricing environment with smart contracts automatically negotiating and completing transactions by monitoring the status of key variables like cost and delivery. They can support micropayments amongst highly distributed parties in microservice transactions, and these have application in the sharing economy. Plus, they can be particularly useful when IoT devices operating at or beyond the edge of an enterprise's reach are integrated into blockchain applications which consume data from their sensors. A blockchain can provide a platform for mobile IoT transactions to be recorded and micropayments made in respect of services. And next up, by enshrining insurance conditions into smart contracts, blockchains can provide opportunities for insurance processes to become automated and much more easily auditable. By dealing directly with customers without intermediaries, accessing data from the internet or IoT sensors attached to the assets being insured, and in some cases executing end-to-end without human intervention. And some examples include, say, in property insurance, where it can be disintermediate the distributed processes that connect the homeowner, mortgage lender, insurer, and so on to set up the insurance, and then also subsequently connect these parties with maintenance firms to provide estimates and undertake remedial work in the case of a claim. And in vehicle insurance, when setting up the insurance, proving ownership and registration and so on, and also in addition with telematics insurance, where IoT sensor data can be logged irrefutably and used to dynamically alter premiums depending on how a car is driven. And in the process of subrogation to recover claim amounts from the at-fault driver's insurer, and that involves multiple parties which definitely don't trust each other. And life insurance, around the death registration process that involves insurers and beneficiaries, medical practices, funeral homes, government services, and so on. Health insurance, again, supporting a seamless flow of, in this case, health information amongst patients, hospitals, insurers, and so on, with the patient in control of third-party access. And travel insurance, which can be activated and deactivated by an event trigger, such as a cruise liner docking or a flight becoming delayed. And here we see blockchain smart contracts and secure data access mechanisms, along with its inherent auditability, can help realize goals of easily yet securely shareable healthcare information for both treatment and insurance purposes. And use cases here include rather universal healthcare records that store patient information, or at least hashed links to it, on a blockchain, with the patients themselves authorizing access for multiple hospitals or insurers. And the immutability of blockchain would ensure that the records remain tamper-proof, and those records could be shared amongst a wider group that includes researchers if the patient has consented to participation in a clinical trial, say. And pharmaceutical companies could also make use of blockchain in their supply chain to track and validate the authenticity of drugs in remote areas. There are a number of use cases emerging in the area of manufacturing and supply chain logistics too. Consider the administrative paperwork for transporting a shipment of goods because of the number of transactions involved through a vast network of intermediaries in different countries and so on. The Maersk shipping line have recently gone on record saying that this could represent as much as 15% of the total shipping cost itself. And if you do a bit of math, looking at the UN figures for global trade and how much of that went by sea, you come up with a figure some way north of $1.6 billion last year, and there's a cost which could cut dramatically if the trade instead relied on autonomous smart contracts running on a blockchain platform, reducing the administrative friction and the intermediary cost. And also records of ownership or leasing agreements for manufactured products could be made available on a blockchain, making the process of transferring and tracking ownership more transparent, connecting buyers and sellers and lessees and lessors, etc. directly, with payments made without the need for an escrow account or an intermediary, potentially providing much more scope for on-demand short-term leasing. The other one that gets a lot of press in this area is the journey that physical assets take across an end-to-end supply chain, and what the data from a blockchain can tell you. And of course, a blockchain's immutable asset register can provide provenance information about every component part in a product, where it came from, where it's been, who's touched it, how it's been treated, and so on. And the richness and the nature of the information held there, and even richer if you integrate an IoT platform, so sensor data gets committed to the chain too. So that information can greatly enhance the quality of decisions made about, say, product safety and recalls and so on. So not only can faulty or spoilt components or ingredients be pinpointed quickly and with a greater degree of accuracy, it also becomes much easier to audit the process and determine which party was responsible for a breach in handling protocol or in the supply of unsuitable goods and so on. And that same traceability characteristic also allows for the tracking of high-value goods across a supply chain, the rooting out of counterfeit items, or the elimination of inappropriately sourced raw materials like conflict minerals. And its inherent transparency means that this information can be made available to all the parties involved, and the record is irrefutable. Now, on this slide, I've used the term Industry 4.0 in the title to distinguish between use cases in traditional manufacturing scenarios, but it is related. So, digital manufacturing processes could use blockchains to eliminate the need for centralized repositories of intellectual property, like product designs. And for instance, smart contracts carrying licensing terms could be enacted when, say, a product design is selected to ensure all the parties involved are duly compensated and any particular usage conditions are met, without the need to involve an intermediary. And taking a wider view, a distributed manufacturing ecosystem could be managed as a sharing economy, where participants from designers through production and logistics to sales are parties on a blockchain network that represents a distributed virtual supply chain, or where resources such as design expertise or 3D printing are leased out on demand in return for those micropayments I talked about earlier. And a scenario like this could provide access to manufacturing resources scaled for producers of all sizes, in all geographies, at economically viable rates. Supply chain use cases apply just as well in the transport industry as they do in any other, but in addition, full lifecycle digital twins or virtual twins can be created for vehicles, for cars, that enable a blockchain to maintain a digital maintenance book that tracks the provenance of its component parts and fine-tunes predictive maintenance schedules. And it's ideal if they have particular maintenance or aftercare requirements, or subsequently they're found to have disproportionately high failure rates and so on. And it can also help manage the vehicle as ownership passes through multiple parties, dealership owner, leasing agent, and so on, right through to disposal, without the need for an intermediary owning that process. And manufacturers that offer different versions of, say, a car that only vary by software or firmware, but based on identical hardware, could deliver personalization to customers based on blockchain identities. And these could be used to apply the same enhancements whether the individual was driving their own car or a rental version of the same model. And a blockchain could enable microservice transactions to pay for electric car recharging from third-party suppliers using data on the vehicle's ownership profile. And the ride-sharing economy could also be disrupted, if you like, by a platform that connects riders directly with drivers without an intermediary, and it manages payments through smart contracts that are triggered automatically. And driver onboarding could also be disintermediated by connecting drivers and government agencies and insurers and so on to get that done a lot easier. And government use cases, well, they revolve mainly around identity and access to services and entitlement and access to public information and so on. And they include things like where publicly available information like land titles or vehicle registration could be made available on a blockchain, and the process of transferring and tracking ownership of assets based on them, such as property, could be made more transparent, with buyers and sellers being connected directly, payments made without the need for an escrow account and intermediary again, to ensure the smooth running of the process. And consider that there are over 1 billion people in the world that simply don't possess sufficient documentation to prove their identities or their entitlements to hold land. A trusted identity could be established with a digital birth certificate issued on a blockchain, timestamped and made available worldwide to help them authenticate themselves when it comes to proving who they are and their entitlement to services or ownership of property or so on. And also even voting processes. I mean, trials are afoot to use blockchain identities to reduce verification costs and also provide an immutable record that the vote was cast and counted. And blockchains in the entertainment industry, well, they could eliminate the need for centralized repositories of intellectual property too, so similar to some of the other use cases we've talked about. For instance, creative assets could be recorded on a blockchain upon creation, and smart contracts carrying licensing terms could be enacted when, say, a piece of music is purchased or streamed. And that would ensure that all the parties involved, the writers, performers, producers, and so on, would pay their due royalties directly without the need to involve an intermediary collection service. And this is going to provide proof of creation, proof of ownership, the transfer of digital assets, rights management, and even micropayment distribution. So, what can we learn from all these early adopters? What are some of the common issues they've faced and dealt with? I've grouped them here in this last section under 3 main topics: technology and market, cultural and adoption, and also governance, legal and regulation. So firstly, what are the technology, process and market considerations? Well, blockchain technology is immature, as is the market. Industry standards for integration are only just emerging, and the vendor ecosystem is still forming. However, many partnerships are already coalescing around open source projects like Ethereum and Hyperledger, and some of the open source partnerships are either looking at how to apply industry standards to their blockchain implementation, as is the case with Ethereum, or they're developing tools to tackle thorny enterprise issues around these problems, like a lot of the Hyperledger projects. And they're bringing on what some are calling a 3rd generation of blockchains that provide enterprise-grade platforms for distributed applications, addressing performance, scalability, and privacy challenges as smart contracts take off and networks expand. And when designing a blockchain-based system, do work to understand which processes need to be shared across a business network and which should be kept private to individual network members. This boundary between internal business process management and cross-boundary blockchain is a point of potential friction, with not only systems integration issues, but also questions to address around data governance and security and so on. And a blockchain network can be more sustainable than traditional business networks, don't forget, because its continued existence doesn't have to be dependent upon the continued existence of a single sponsoring or controlling authority. It can have a lifespan of its own. And while we're on the subject of lifespans, when using a public blockchain, do be aware that its immutability means that the encrypted data that you store on there will be around for the life of the ledger if you look back far enough in the chain. However, the chosen encryption algorithm may not necessarily remain uncrackable 10, 20, or 30 years into the future. And that's something people are talking about in the context of trying to develop a quantum computing proof cryptography for blockchains. And so what are the adoption, culture, and policy considerations? Well, make sure you go through a checklist for blockchain affinity. Just because something's technologically possible, it might not necessarily be economically sensible or socially advisable, actually. And when considering an implementation, don't forget the cultural implications. Understand who the losers and the winners will be. Intermediaries will need to cede control, and some parties may not believe they're seeing the benefits in return. Also, there's a skill shortage. There's a lack of talent and technology know-how, so you're probably not going to have access to all the people you need in-house, so make sure that you partner well. And whilst most blockchain initiatives still tend to be founder-led, where an organization seeks to enhance its own business through the development of blockchain solutions for its existing business network, as the market matures, we are seeing patterns emerge where much less asymmetric consortium groups are proposing projects together, trade groups, for example, on business networks, suggesting a focus away from attempts to impose a blockchain solution on an ecosystem to one that's driven much more by shared vision, shared value, and so on. And also, whilst many adopters may start off by looking to blockchain to provide efficiency savings in terms of disintermediarization, the technology does have the potential to disrupt and revolutionize business models and whole industries. But because very few blockchain concepts have been proven at scale in a commercial setting so far, there is a paucity of hard data as to how these process and experience changes brought about by large-scale blockchain in production initiatives actually do affect stakeholder, customer, and market behavior. And finally, what's the bigger picture with regard to governance, regulation, and legal? Well, there's currently a lack of regulatory clarity on blockchain implementations relating to questions around exactly what's allowed to be stored on a distributed blockchain, and where, and who should have access to it, and so on. The law is inevitably playing catch-up, and it's doing so across all the legal jurisdictions the members of a network may inhabit. So any legal position is going to be inconsistent. So inevitably there are going to be risks, but just make sure that you and your stakeholders on your blockchain business network are aware of them and have the appetite for them. And until there's a test case that teases out the legal interpretations of the EU's GDPR as they apply to blockchains, it's unclear how strictly some of the regulations articles would need to be applied. Blockchain's immutability is most likely to cause GDPR headaches. Put simply, on-chain data cannot be deleted once it's committed. So where does that leave the GDPR's famous right to be forgotten? Well, the easiest option would be to ensure that no personal data itself is ever stored on-chain. Instead, only a reference to an off-chain data store and a hash value would be committed, so that off-chain personal data can then be managed in much the same way as any other GDPR-relevant data. You could also destroy the key, but then that does still leave the encrypted version a risk of being cracked at some point in the future by some enormous quantum computer. When implementing a blockchain-powered solution, think about who needs to change the data, who needs to validate it, who even needs to know that the transaction and the parties are involved. Answers to these questions will help you settle on a public or private permissioned blockchain network and guide you as to whether you need mechanisms in place to provide additional privacy. And finally, consider the shared governance of supposedly autonomous smart contracts. What mechanisms are there to effect changes to the contracts should that become necessary? For example, because of subsequent legislation after the code has been implemented, or if the contracts are found to contain an error or a vulnerability. Essentially, how can smart contracts be patched? And what happens if something unexpected happens? Are your organization's legal policies able to accommodate the operation of autonomous applications operating on its behalf? And so on that wary note of caution, I'm going to now hand the metaphorical mic over to Austin. He's got a couple of slides for you and a demo to show you. And as I said earlier, we should have time to take some questions at the end. So over to you, Austin.
All right. Thank you, Craig. That was a great presentation. You made some great points over why blockchain is such a revolutionary technology, as it provides trust and transparency in a trustless environment and cuts out the need for intermediaries in some contexts. So I'm going to move over to a blockchain demo. In this demo, we're going to explore an example of a blockchain solution for vehicle titling and service history, and then delve into why blockchain improves upon the current solution that we have in the U.S. today. So buying a used car from a private party can often be quite a hassle. You don't really know whether the vehicle's been taken care of or that it's been completely paid off, and the person selling the vehicle to you, like, how would you know that the person didn't roll back the mileage or forge the title? Perhaps they even stole the vehicle. And so you are basically trusting the person that is selling you the vehicle. And so adding blockchain to this would allow you to have an extra layer of security. So yeah, as I mentioned, we have paper titles to confirm that someone has the authority to sell the vehicle, that they currently have ownership, but paper titles can be forged. And then we also use services like Carfax to get the vehicle service history on a vehicle. But we have to trust that Carfax is not taking bribes and altering the service history or documents for a vehicle. So and this is a great example in which blockchain could revolutionize the car ownership experience. If car manufacturers were able to add vehicles to a publicly available centralized registry, car buyers could then own this digital title and prove ownership and the title status on the blockchain. You could easily confirm the number of owners that the vehicle has had and see a complete service history of the vehicle. And so this is an example where there are multiple parties and multiple companies that work here, and they all share control over the data in a low-trust environment. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And also as a note to the audience, you can move the media screen where the demo is being shown and expand it to make it larger such that you can see more detail. All right, so in this demo, we have built a service center site on Appian that integrates with this centralized registry of vehicles produced by a variety of manufacturers. These service centers can then add service events to the vehicles in the registry, as well as be able to query the history and information of a vehicle. Everything you'll see here is built using Appian's low-code environment, using drag-and-drop UI components, and Sail, our expression language. So we'll start off on this service center site with our new hire and technician, Andrew, who is starting his first day at our service center. He's going to start off by creating a wallet, which will allow him to sign off on service events. So a wallet essentially allows a user to cryptographically sign information on the blockchain. And so it allows us to have an audit trail to confirm who, or to be able to track down who exactly performed what operation on the blockchain. So I'm going to navigate over to creating a wallet, and all I have to do is have Andrew type in his password, or type in a password, which will allow him to unlock the wallet and confirm transactions. So I'm going to create a quick password and create the wallet. And from here on out, Appian will be able to maintain control over the wallets, and Andrew does not have to install anything or do anything else on the blockchain. So now that Andrew has created his wallets, I, the manager of the service center, so I'll open up a different user account on this site, can go in and add Andrew as a technician to the service center. So I will first search Andrew, and that will pull him up. All right, and so this has now pulled up his wallet information. He's not currently a technician, so he's not authorized yet to do service events on vehicles. So I'm now going to sign this transaction, and by hitting Add Technician, this is now sending this information to our smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain, which is adding Andrew and giving him the capability to perform service on behalf of my service center. So Andrew can now go to the service center vehicles. Let's say that Andrew is now brought in his first vehicle. So this car we've not yet seen this vehicle in our service center. It's not listed on the current VINs that we have seen. So Andrew is going to type in the VIN, and it's going to query the blockchain, and it's confirming that the VIN is valid and that is in the centralized registry of vehicles. So Andrew's going to hit add service to the vehicle, which is now querying the blockchain for all of the information on the vehicle. So that includes all the metadata as well as the current mileage and service events performed by other service centers. So we can see that Andrew, we can see all the, as I said, the vehicle summary. So we see that the vehicle is in the contract that is produced by General Motors Company. So General Motors has its own smart contract in which it can then produce vehicles. So we can confirm the authenticity of this vehicle. We can see the current mileage as well as the number of events that have been added to this vehicle. And so you can see the history of the vehicle. It's been inspected 3 times by Cadillac of Phoenix, and also the BMW of San Diego has performed a major service on the brakes. They've also attached a service document, which is a hash to IPFS, which allows me to access this document given a hash, and so I can download the document that the BMW of San Diego has provided. So Andrew is not yet authorized to add service events, so it's possible that it is still mining the transaction which allowed him to be added to the smart contract for the service center. So I'm going to refresh the page. All right, he is now authorized to add service events to this vehicle. So I'm going to go ahead and add a service event. I can see that this vehicle from GM is overdue for an oil change. So I'm going to go in and just add a maintenance. I'm going to update the mileage. It is now at 19,000 miles. I'm going to upload a service document, which is going to add it to the IPFS network and add the hash to the Ethereum car registry. I'm going to add some notes that I did a oil change. And then when I hit next, I'm going to be able to sign this data and basically say that this data is all correct. So I'm going to type in my passphrase to unlock my wallet. I'm going to sign this transaction. And then on this next step, I will be able to publish this information to the blockchain, which will then be mined. And essentially, mining is allowing the blockchain network to confirm that this transaction did indeed come from a authorized source, as the Ethereum network is a public network, and so anyone can add transactions, but given how the smart contract has been set up, only authorized service centers may add transactions to vehicles. And so if I were to open up that vehicle again, as it's not yet been mined, I can see now it's actually popping up locally in my database. So I'm querying again the blockchain and pulling open the vehicle information. I see locally that I have the service performed. So on the bottom side, or on the bottom grid here, we see that I have this service events. I can track down exactly who performed the service. So Andrew Fathman signed this transaction, and so if our customer comes back into the service center and wants to know more information about what was done to the vehicle, we can track down exactly which service representative performed the service on the vehicle. We can also access the service document, and once the transaction has been mined, we'll actually see the events on the official registry of blockchain events. So if I refresh the page one more time, and once the transaction has gone through, I will be able to see the transaction I just added to the official blockchain registry for this vehicle. I can see that the number of events has been updated as well as the mileage. So there's a lot more that can be built out, and obviously this is just an example use case, but it gets us to a certain level of simplicity with a blockchain-backed application. With the exception of the wallet creation, the user doesn't really have to know that they're even working with a blockchain application, yet the service center is able to harness all of the public information and contribute service events in a authorized manner. in this low trust environment. And so anyone can then go in and query these events, see the service history of a vehicle, see who owns it, see that the title is clear or that it's been rebuilt or that it's a salvage title. And so we're able to build out a lot of value from having all this information on the public blockchain. And that about does it for the live demo portion of the webinar. So we're going to open things up for some Q&A. All right. So, Craig, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you clarify what smart contracts really mean? Are we talking about executing legal agreements between parties like statements of work, or is this more about machine-to-machine execution of work?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate term, really, and I think that's one of the reasons why in the Hyperledger universe they don't really refer to smart contracts as the term for their executable code. They call it chain code. So what we're really talking about is business logic. It's code that can execute from the chain to give you distributed applications. It isn't necessarily a legal contract, but unfortunately that name has stuck. So I can quite understand why the audience member has got that query. I hope that clears things up.
So we have another question for you, Craig. Could you explain a bit more about mining in an enterprise application or environment?
Right. Well, Austin may also have a view on this. I mean, mining is a process that's tied to a particular consensus mechanism. We often talk about mining in the context of proof of work, and it's the miners that are able to control the commitment of blocks of transactions to the blockchain. They are solving cryptographic problems that are increasingly difficult to do, but they're fairly straightforward to verify. And so that's why mining costs so much compute power, costs so much energy to do, and that gives you the cost of the network. And it really only is relevant in an enterprise context if you're choosing to use a public open blockchain network such as Ethereum or Bitcoin or what have you. If you were actually using a private network, a permission network, there would be no need to resort to that sort of consensus mechanism. You wouldn't need to resort to proof of work, and therefore you wouldn't need to incentivize the miners, and that would reduce the cost. But you would only really be able to do that in a particular context where there was an overlay, if you like, of a business relationships between the parties on the blockchain network that you could fall back upon as well. So hopefully that clears things up. Maybe, Austin, do you want to jump in? Because your application uses Ethereum, and you were talking about mining in your demo a bit, weren't you?
Yes, correct. So in the case of mining, as you had mentioned, Craig, essentially the computers have every computer inside of this network for a blockchain has some sort of consensus algorithm. And so in this case, in the Ethereum network, we do have a proof of work algorithm, which essentially is, it takes a lot of computation power in order for a transaction to be confirmed. So they're taking the data and crunching the numbers and before they actually add the information to the blockchain. And so this information is being, in this case, in my example, I was using the test network for Ethereum. So there are multiple Ethereum instances. There's a main network as well as a bunch of test networks where there's a much smaller number of computers, which is, in this case, why there's a lot of transactions, because you can get the mining for free in this case. It's all people just volunteering their time, or processors in this case. And I have another question. How would a correction be processed to the service transaction just entered into by Andrew? Let's say that there's a training issue. So in this case, blockchain is obviously immutable. So in order to be able to actually produce a correction, you would have to add a new event to the blockchain, which may be a special event that's an amendment. And so the initial transaction that you processed will always be there, but you can invalidate that data with a second transaction saying, hey, we made a mistake with this previous transaction. Please take this information that I currently am presenting now as the new information and new source. And so in this low trust environment, you could design your application to go and basically audit and be able to see, okay, this service center is producing a lot of mistakes. Perhaps we're not going to trust necessarily the information that they're providing. Or you could just say, okay, the most recent transaction that has occurred is the most accurate information. Another question for you, Craig. What do you see as the biggest roadblock to the mainstream blockchain adoption?
Biggest roadblock. Right, I've got to pick one, have I? Okay. A lot of things that get in the way or provide challenges for widespread and enterprise adoption of any blockchain application is its ability to operate in an enterprise environment. So, okay, I'm going to do the analyst thing. I'm going to say several things under one umbrella to give you one answer. So it's basically the enterprise hardening of blockchain. So that covers scalability, it covers speed and performance issues, it covers integration with other systems so that you can treat it like another part of your IT estate. So I think the biggest hurdle is really to get it to a state where you can treat a blockchain part of your applications as just another part of the technology. You don't have to, we end up living in a post-blockchain world, if you like. We no longer talk about blockchain projects, they're just simply projects. So I think the biggest hurdle is getting into a position where it can be treated like all the other bits of tech that you have to do and all the kind of other typical enterprise things you have to do around that.
All right, thank you, Craig. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let's see. So I guess the question here is, how should I get started and what should I do next? What considerations and initial steps would you recommend when looking into applying blockchain in your first project? Kind of a broad question, but.
Okay. Shall I jump in first? I mean, I think the first thing you need to do is you need to understand what your business problem, your opportunity, and your partner's problem and opportunities actually are. You need to clarify how well your organization understands blockchain and that it has capability to take a project forward, or if it doesn't, you need to find a partner that does and one that you trust. You need to assess the opportunity for blockchain affinity, so some of those kind of checklist of questions that I covered earlier. It's also very useful to establish partnerships across functions in your organization, across industry and so on. Very useful there. You need to really determine which are the technologies, which are the vendors that are a good fit. What sort of blockchain are you looking for? Is it public? Is it permissioned? What sort of consensus mechanisms are appropriate? And then develop a proof of concept and all the various associated business models and adoption strategies, not just for yourself, but for all the other partners on your network. And very importantly, of course, some metrics for assessing success. So work out how well you were doing things before and how it's improved now. And very, very importantly, work out, kind of related to the last question, work out how it's going to integrate with the rest of your IT estate, the rest of your technologies and applications, and then go through that usual process of deploy and test and assess impact and review and learn and repeat and so on. So that's broadly, I guess, what you should do. What you should do on Monday morning if you wanted to get cracking with something like this. Austin, anything to add on that?
No, I think you did a very good job of explaining that. All right. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Craig, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. As I mentioned in the beginning, this entire session has been recorded, and we will send out the recording as soon as it's available. I'll also try to follow up with these questions that we didn't get the time to answer. And And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.